The desert wind carried the scent of cordite and shame across Camp Pendleton's firing range as Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez felt general. Morrison's weathered hands close around her Barrett M82A1, the 50 caliber sniper rifle, her rifle. The one she'd carried through 3 deployments and countless sleepless nights suddenly felt foreign in another man's grip. "Let me show you how a real soldier handles this weapon, sweetheart." Morrison's voice dripped with the kind of condescension that had followed Elena through 8 years of military service. His breath reeked of whiskey despite the morning hour, and his dress blue strained against a belly that hadn't seen combat in decades. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena's jaw tightened as she watched him fumble with the weapon's adjustment knobs, his thick fingers betraying an unfamiliarity that made her skin crawl. Around them, a crowd of Marines had gathered, some drawn by curiosity, others by the electric tension that crackled between the highest-ranking officer on base and the woman who'd earned more commendations than most of them would see in their entire careers. Corporal James "Rabbit" Sullivan, Elena's spotter and closest friend, shifted uncomfortably beside her. His freckled face was flushed with anger, but military protocol kept his mouth shut. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the range safety officer, stood frozen between duty and disgust, her dark eyes reflecting the internal battle every woman in uniform knew too well. The Barrett had been Elena's constant companion since her first deployment to Afghanistan. She'd acquired it after her previous sniper rifle was destroyed in an IED blast that killed her original spotter, Sergeant Tommy Chun. The weapon bore scars, a dent near the scope from shrapnel in Helmand Province, scratches along the stock from a desperate crawl through Iraqi rubble, and a small notch she'd carved herself after her 100th confirmed kill. Each mark told a story of survival, of precision, of the weight of decisions made through crosshairs. Morrison hefted the 30-pound rifle awkwardly, his form betraying years of desk duty. "You women always overthink the mechanics," he continued, his voice carrying across the range where other Marines pretended to focus on their own weapons. "It's about strength, about having the balls to pull the trigger when it counts." Elena's mother's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken in Spanish. During their last phone call, "Mia, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Your worth isn't measured by their approval." But standing here, watching this man desecrate everything she'd built, Elena felt the familiar fire that had driven her from the poverty of East Los Angeles to the elite ranks of Marine snipers. Shooting competition had been Morrison's idea, announced during the morning briefing with the kind of theatrical flourish he loved. "I hear we've got ourselves a real Annie Oakley," he'd said, his eyes fixed on Elena. "But this isn't the Old West, and paper targets don't shoot back. Time to see what she's really made of." What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elena had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Not this specific confrontation, but the moment when she would have to choose between silence and standing up for something greater than herself. The choice between enduring and fighting back. The targets downrange stood at varying distances: standard bullseyes at 100 and 200 meters, steel plates at 400 and 600, and the challenging long-range targets at 800 and 1,000 meters. But Morrison had added his own twist, human-shaped silhouettes scattered between the regulation targets, each one designed to test not just accuracy, but the psychological weight of aiming at something that resembled a person. 10 targets, 1 shot each, Morrison announced loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Winner takes all." He paused, his smile cruel. "Though I suppose we both know how this ends." Elena's hands remained steady at her sides, but her mind raced through calculations. Wind speed, 5 to 7 knots from the southeast. Temperature, rising toward 90 degrees. Humidity, low, typical for Southern California in late summer. Her body knew these conditions like a pianist knows scales muscle memory built through Thousands of rounds downrange. Rabbit stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "LT, you don't have to do this. This is bullshit, and everyone knows it." But Elena was already moving, her decision crystallizing like frost on a winter morning. "Actually, General," she said, her voice cutting through the desert air with surgical precision, "let me check the zero on that rifle first. Wouldn't want any mechanical issues to affect the demonstration." Morrison's eyes narrowed, but protocol demanded he comply. As Elena reached for her weapon, his grip tightened possessively. For a heartbeat, they stood connected by 30 pounds of steel and aluminum, the instrument that had defined Elena's career suspended between them like a bridge over an abyss. That's when Elena moved. Her left hand swept up in a perfect arc, striking Morrison's extended arm at the precise pressure point where the radial nerve crossed the humerus. The technique learned not from military training but from her uncle Carlos, a former boxer who taught her that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies was to hit back harder. Applied exactly the right amount of force to disrupt Morrison's grip without causing permanent damage. The crack that followed wasn't the bone breaking, but the general's arms snapping back as his nervous system temporarily short-circuited. Morrison's face went white, his mouth opening in a soundless gasp as the Barrett slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Elena caught her rifle before it hit the ground, the familiar weight settling into her arms like a missing piece of her soul returning home. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds, but it felt like watching lightning strike in slow motion. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 Marines, sailors, and assorted personnel stood frozen in a moment that would be retold in barracks and mess halls for decades to come. Morrison cradled his arm against his chest, his face cycling through shock, rage, and something that might have been respect. But Elena wasn't finished. With movements as fluid as water, she dropped to the prone position, her body aligning with the rifle like planets finding their orbit. The scope's crosshairs found the first target, a steel plate, at 400 meters, as naturally as her lungs found their next breath. "Ma'am," Rabbit whispered, dropping beside her in the spotter position. "Wind's picking up. Call it 7 knots, maybe 8. Elena's finger found the trigger, that familiar crescent of metal she'd caressed through firefights and competitions. Through moments when a single bullet meant the difference between her squad coming home or being carried in flag-draped boxes. The world narrowed to the circle of her scope, the rhythm of her heartbeat, the whisper of wind across the desert. The first shot rang out like thunder, and the steel plate at 400 meters sang as the .50 caliber round struck dead center. Before the echo faded, Elena was already acquiring her second target, her breathing steady and controlled. Target 2, bullseye at 200 meters. The paper target disintegrated in a shower of fragments. Target 3, moving steel plate at 600 meters, swaying in the desert wind. Elena led it by half a mil dot and squeezed. The plate spun wildly as the massive bullet transferred its energy. Each shot was a statement, a declaration written in gunpowder and precision. Elena wasn't just hitting targets, she was rewriting the narrative that had followed her since the day she first picked up a rifle. With every pull of the trigger, she was answering questions that had never been asked fairly, proving points that should never have needed proving. Morrison had straightened, his arm hanging at an odd angle, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Around them, the crowd had swollen to include officers and enlisted personnel from across the base. Some watched with professional appreciation for marksmanship they'd rarely witnessed. Others seemed to grasp the larger significance of what was unfolding, a moment when the old order met something it couldn't dismiss or diminish. Target 4 through 7 fell in rapid succession. A human silhouette at 300 meters took a round through the head ring. Another steel plate at 800 meters rang like a bell. A small bullseye at 100 meters exploded in a cloud of paper and paste, and a moving target designed to simulate a running Enemy soldier took a perfect center mass hit. By the 8th target, even the most skeptical observers had fallen silent. Elena's shooting wasn't just accurate, it was transcendent. Each shot flowed from the last like verses in a poem written in ballistics and physics. The Barrett M82A1, designed to disable vehicles and penetrate armor, was singing in her hands with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Target 9 was the challenge Morrison had saved for last, a small steel plate at 1,000 meters, partially concealed behind a barrier to simulate real combat conditions. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and Elena made minute adjustments to her scope's elevation and windage knobs. "That's an impossible shot," someone muttered. From the crowd, Elena's response was to squeeze the trigger. The bullet's flight time to a target at 1,000 meters is roughly 1.4 seconds, an eternity in the world of precision shooting. Elena remained perfectly still, watching through her scope as the bullet traced its parabolic arc across the desert sky. When the distant steel plate shattered into pieces, the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and stunned silence. But Elena wasn't done. As she swung her rifle toward the 10th and final target, another 1,000-meter steel plate positioned at an extreme angle to test her ability to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift, she felt the weight of every moment that had led to this instant. Every slight, every condescending comment, every time she'd been forced to smile and nod while lesser men questioned her competence. The final shot was perfect. Not just accurate, but perfect, a mathematical expression of skill, determination, and the kind of quiet fury that transforms ordinary people into legends. As the echo of the 10th shot faded across the desert, Elena slowly rose to her feet. The Barrett remained cradled in her arms, smoke rising from its muzzle like incense in a cathedral dedicated to precision. Morrison stood 20 feet away, his injured arm forgotten, his face reflecting the dawning realization that he'd just witnessed something extraordinary. But Elena's victory came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. As the crowd began to disperse, she caught fragments of conversations that would follow her for the rest of her career. "Did you see how she handled the general? Think she faced charges? That was either the ballsiest thing I've ever seen, or career suicide." Rabbit appeared at her side, his young face split by a grin that couldn't quite hide his concern. "Ma'am, holy shit, that was incredible. But what happens now?" Elena looked across the firing range, where maintenance crews were already moving to collect the destroyed targets. The sun was climbing higher, promising another scorching day in the Southern California desert. Somewhere beyond the hills, civilians were going about their morning routines, unaware that something significant had just shifted in a small corner of their world. "I don't know, Rabbit," she said quietly, her voice carrying notes of exhaustion and exhilaration in equal measure. "I honestly don't know." What Elena did know was that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman who'd fired those 10 perfect shots wasn't the same person who'd stood silently while General Morrison grabbed her rifle. Something fundamental had changed in those few minutes, something that went beyond marksmanship or military protocol. As she walked toward the armory to secure her weapon, Elena felt the weight of eyes following her. Some watched with admiration, others with calculation, still others with the kind of uncertainty that comes when established hierarchies are suddenly called into question. But all of them watched, and Elena knew that her story, whatever it was, destined to become, was just beginning. The morning sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, reports would be filed, investigations would begin, and the machinery of military justice would start its slow grind. But for now, in this moment suspended between action and consequence, Elena Vasquez walked across the firing range as perhaps the most dangerous woman in the United States Marine Corps. And somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with news. That would change everything. Base commander to all units. We have a situation developing. Priority Alpha Protocol is now in effect. 3 months before the confrontation that would define her career, Elena Vasquez sat in her small off-base apartment, methodically cleaning her personal firearms while CNN droned in the background. The ritual had become sacred to her. Every Tuesday evening, she would strip down her Glock 19, her backup rifle, and when she could bring it home, her beloved Barrett. Each piece was examined, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled with the kind of meditative precision that others might reserve for prayer. The apartment itself told the story of a life lived between two worlds. Military efficiency dominated the space. A perfectly made bed with hospital corners, boots aligned precisely beside the door, uniforms hanging in order of frequency of use. But scattered throughout were traces of the woman behind the Marine her grandmother's rosary draped over a framed photo of her family, a collection of books in Spanish and English stacked beside her reading chair, and a small altar to Saint Barbara, patron saint of artillery. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carmen in Los Angeles. Saw your picture in Marine Times. Mom's bragging to everyone at church again. When are you coming home? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged rifle. Home. Elena had been asking herself the same question for 8 years, ever since she'd stepped off the bus at Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego, and discovered that the girl from East LA was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Her morning routine began at 0430, regardless of whether she was on duty. Elena believed that discipline was like marksmanship. It required daily practice to maintain. She would wake without an alarm, her internal clock calibrated by years of military service, and begin with 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, and a 3-mile run through the hills surrounding Oceanside. The run was where Elena's mind was most free. As her feet found their rhythm on the asphalt, she would let her thoughts drift to the contradictions that defined her existence. She was a sniper, a job that required her to remain invisible, to strike from shadows and disappear like smoke. Yet everything about her presence on base seemed to invite attention, scrutiny, and the kind of commentary that followed women in combat roles. During one particularly challenging morning run, Elena had encountered General Morrison for the first time. He'd been jogging in the opposite direction, his pace labored and his form sloppy. As they passed, he'd called out, "Slow down there, soldier. You're making the rest of us look bad." Elena had smiled and nodded, but the encounter stuck with her. Later, she'd learned that Morrison had been asking questions about her performance evaluations, her deployment record, her attitude. The word had been whispered by well-meaning NCOs who thought she should know what the brass was saying. Attitude. Elena had heard the word used to describe every woman who'd refused to shrink herself to fit into spaces designed for men. It was code, a shorthand that meant she doesn't know her place, or she asks too many questions, or simply she exists in a way that makes us uncomfortable. But Elena's attitude had been forged in fires that most of these men couldn't imagine. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she'd learned early that the world was divided into predators and prey, and the only choice that mattered was which one you decided to be. Her father had disappeared when she was 12, leaving behind debts to dangerous men and a family struggling to survive. Her mother, Isabella, had worked 3 jobs to keep Elena and her siblings fed, clothed, and in school. Elena's path to the Marines had begun in her junior year of high school, when a recruiter named Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Williams had visited her OTC class. Williams was everything Elena wanted to become: confident, respected, deadly serious about her profession. After the presentation, Elena had approached her with a question that would change her life. "What do I have to do to become like you?" The answer had been both simple and complex: everything. Elena would have to excel academically, physically, and mentally. She would have to prove herself not just once, but constantly forever. She would have to accept that her victories would be questioned, her defeats magnified, and her every move scrutinized by people looking for evidence that she didn't belong. Elena had accepted those terms. Without hesitation, her first deployment to Afghanistan had been a revelation. Away from the politics and posturing of garrison life, Elena had discovered what she was truly capable of. Her first confirmed kill came during a Taliban ambush on her convoy, a sniper positioned in a minaret 600 meters away, systematically picking off Marines pinned down in a kill zone. Elena had spotted the muzzle flash, calculated the wind and distance in seconds, and put a .338 Lapua Magnum round through the sniper's chest. The enemy fire had stopped immediately, and her convoy had been able to extract without further casualties. That night, writing in her journal by flashlight, Elena had tried to capture what it felt like to save lives by taking one. "It's not like the movies," she'd written. "There's no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just the weight of a decision and the knowledge that 20 Marines are going home to their families because of what I did today. I can live with that weight." But the weight had accumulated over 3 deployments. Elena's confirmed kill count stood at 127, a number that made her one of the most lethal snipers in Marine Corps' history. Each number represented a human being whose story had ended in her crosshairs, and Elena carried every one of them with her. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate the professional sniper from the woman who loved her family, who read poetry in Spanish, who sometimes cried during Pixar movies. But the lines weren't always clear, and the contradictions sometimes threatened to tear her apart. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the base psychologist, had become Elena's confidant during her mandatory post-deployment sessions. Martinez was one of the few people on base who seemed to understand the unique pressures Elena faced as both a woman and a highly skilled killer. "You're carrying more than just the weight of your actions," Martinez had observed during one of their sessions. "You're carrying the expectations of everyone who wants you to fail and everyone who needs you to succeed. That's not sustainable." Elena had nodded but hadn't known how to respond. Sustainability wasn't a luxury she felt she could afford. Every day brought new challenges to her place in the Corps, new tests of her competence and character. She couldn't simply be good at her job. She had to be exceptional. She couldn't just fit in. She had to prove that women belonged in roles that had been exclusively male for centuries. The pressure had manifested in ways both large and small. Elena found herself triple-checking her gear, arriving early for every briefing, volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. She'd learned to navigate the delicate balance between being respected as a professional and being accepted as a member of the team. Some of her male colleagues had become genuine friends and allies. Rabbit, her current spotter, had initially been skeptical of working with a female sniper. But after their first mission together, a complex, urban operation in Fallujah, where Elena had eliminated 3 insurgents in rapid succession, he'd become her most loyal supporter. "Ma'am," he'd said as they'd extracted from that mission, "I don't care if you're a woman, a Martian, or a trained dolphin. You're the best damn shot I've ever worked with, and I'd follow you into hell with a water pistol." Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had become something closer to a sister. As one of the few women in combat roles on base, Santos understood the daily negotiations that Elena's presence required. They would meet for coffee on Sunday mornings, sharing stories and strategies for surviving in a world that seemed designed to test their resolve. "The thing they don't tell you," Santos had said during one of their conversations, "is that we're not just fighting the enemy. We're fighting history, tradition, and the expectations of everyone who thinks we're just playing soldier until we find a husband and settle down." Elena's relationships with men had been complicated by her profession. Civilian men were often intimidated by her skills and experiences, while military men sometimes saw her as either a conquest to be claimed or a threat to be neutralized. She'd had a few relationships over the years, but none had survived the reality of who she was and what she did for a living. Her family remained her anchor, even from a distance. Elena called her mother every Sunday, listening to updates about her siblings' lives, her nephew's soccer games, and the neighborhood gossip. That seemed simultaneously trivial and essential. Her mother had never fully understood Elena's choice to join the military, but she'd learned to take pride in her daughter's achievements. "Mia," her mother had said during their last conversation, "I saw on the news that women can now serve. In all combat roles. I thought they already could because of you." The comment had stayed with Elena for days. In her mother's mind, Elena had always been capable of anything she set out to do. The idea that there might be barriers or limitations based on her gender simply didn't compute. It was a perspective both beautiful and heartbreaking, a reminder of how different the world looked from inside. Elena's daily reality. Elena's daily life on base was a carefully choreographed performance. She arrived at the armory each morning at 0630, checked her equipment with ritualistic precision, and prepared for whatever training or operations the day might bring. She'd learned to read the moods and politics of her unit, to know when to speak up and when to remain silent, to navigate the complex social dynamics that could make or break a military career. The other snipers in her unit had gradually accepted her presence, though some remained skeptical. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, a veteran of 5 deployments, had initially refused to work with Elena, but after she'd saved his life during a patrol in Helmand Province, spotting an IED that his team had missed and eliminating the triggermen before he could detonate it, Thompson had become one of her most vocal supporters. "Vasquez doesn't shoot like a woman or a man," Thompson had told a group of new arrivals. "She shoots like a fucking sniper. And if you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with the Taliban." But not everyone had come around. There were still whispers, still comments designed to undermine her confidence or question her competence. Elena had learned to let most of them roll off her back, but some cut deeper than others. The suggestion that she'd earned her position through sexual favors rather than merit. The implication that her emotions would compromise her judgment in combat. The assumption that she was just marking time until she found a husband and started a family. Each comment was a test, and Elena had passed them all through sheer force of will and exceptional performance. But the cumulative weight was exhausting. She sometimes wondered what it would be like to simply be good at her job without the constant need to prove that she deserved to have it. Elena's apartment bore witness to these internal struggles. Late at night, after particularly difficult days, she would sit at her small desk and write in a journal that she kept locked in a fireproof safe. The entries were a mixture of professional observations, personal reflections, and the kind of raw honesty that she couldn't share with anyone else. "Had another conversation with the chaplain today," read one entry from 6 weeks before the confrontation with Morrison. "He asked if I ever felt conflicted about killing. I wanted to tell him that the conflict isn't in the killing, it's in everything else. It's in having to justify my existence every single day. It's in being held to standards that no one else has to meet. It's in watching lesser men advance while I fight for every scrap of recognition." The entry continued, "But I can't say that to him or anyone else because it would sound like complaining. And complainers don't last long in this business. So I smiled and told him that I pray for the souls of every person I've killed, which is true. What I didn't tell him is that I also pray for the strength to keep doing this job in a world that sometimes feels like it's trying to break me." Elena's faith had been another source of internal conflict. Raised Catholic, she struggled to reconcile her role as a sniper with the commandment against killing. Father Rodriguez, a Marine chaplain who'd served multiple deployments, had helped her work through the theological implications of her profession. "God doesn't call us to be pacifists in the face of evil," he'd told her during one of their discussions. "Sometimes the most merciful thing we can do is to stop those who would harm the innocent." "Your skills are a gift, Elena. How you use them determines whether that gift serves God or serves your own pride. The conversation had provided some measure of peace, but the questions remained. Elena found herself examining her motivations before every mission, ensuring that she was acting from a sense of duty rather than personal anger or ambition. It was a level of self-reflection that most of her colleagues never bothered with, but Elena knew that her actions would be scrutinized more carefully than theirs. Training had become her refuge, the one place where politics and personalities fell away, leaving only the pure relationship between shooter, rifle, and target. Elena would spend hours on the range, pushing the limits of distance and precision, exploring the outer boundaries of what was possible with her equipment and skills. Her personal best shot had been made during a training exercise at 29 palms, a cold-bore shot at 1,847 meters, hitting a target the size of a dinner plate in 15-knot crosswinds. The shot had required calculations involving bullet drop, wind drift, atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity variables that Elena processed instinctively after years of experience. But it wasn't the distance that made the shot special, it was the circumstances. Elena had been having doubts about her place in the corps, questioning whether the constant battles for respect and recognition were worth the personal cost. The shot had reminded her why she'd chosen this profession: the pure satisfaction of perfect execution, the knowledge that her skills could mean the difference between her Marines coming home alive or in body bags. As the date of the confrontation with General Morrison approached, Elena had been sensing a shift in the atmosphere on base. There were more whispers, more pointed questions about her attitude and her future plans. Morrison himself had been making subtle inquiries about her background, her relationships, and her psychological evaluations. Elena had tried to prepare for whatever was coming, but she hadn't anticipated the fury she would feel when Morrison's hands closed around her rifle. The Barrett wasn't just a weapon to her, it was an extension of her professional identity, a tool that had saved countless lives and defined her place in the world. Watching Morrison handle it with casual disrespect had triggered something primal and fierce. The morning of the confrontation, Elena had awakened with an unusual sense of clarity. Her dreams had been filled with images of her grandmother, who had fled Mexico during the Revolution and rebuilt her life through sheer determination. Mia, her grandmother, had always said, "There comes a time when you must choose between being comfortable and being true to yourself. Choose truth, even when it costs you everything." Elena had chosen truth, and now she was about to discover what it would cost her. The 24 hours following Elena's confrontation with General Morrison unfolded like a controlled detonation, each event triggering the next in a chain reaction that would reshape the power dynamics of Camp Pendleton. What began as whispers in the mess hall escalated into formal investigations, media attention, and a reckoning that neither Elena nor the Marine Corps had anticipated. Elena's first indication that her actions had created a seismic shift came at 05:03, the morning after the shooting demonstration, when she arrived at the armory to find her access card deactivated. Sergeant Major Williams, the armorer, met her at the door with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional obligation. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Williams said, his voice carefully neutral, "I've been instructed to inform you that your weapons privileges have been temporarily suspended pending an investigation into yesterday's incident." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Being separated from her weapons wasn't just a professional setback, it was an attack on her identity. "What kind of investigation, Sergeant Major?" Williams handed her an official envelope bearing the seal of the base commander. "You're to report to Colonel Henderson's office at 0800. "I'm sorry, Elena. This is coming from way above my pay grade." As Elena walked back to her quarters, she noticed the stares and conversations that stopped abruptly. As she passed, word of her confrontation with Morrison had spread through the base like wildfire, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she'd done and what it meant. In her apartment, Elena opened Colonel Henderson's letter with steady hands. The language was formal, but the message was clear. She was being investigated for assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming and insubordination. The potential penalties included court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge. Elena's phone rang as she finished reading the charges. Rabbit's voice was tight with concern. "Ma'am, I've been trying to reach you. They're saying all kinds of crazy shit about yesterday. Half the base thinks you're a hero, and the other half thinks you've lost your mind. What are you hearing, Rabbit? That General Morrison is claiming you attacked him without provocation. That you're having some kind of psychological breakdown. That you're a security risk." Rabbit paused. "But ma'am, I was there. I saw what happened. That old bastard grabbed your rifle like he owned it, and you defended yourself. Anyone with eyes could see that." After hanging up with Rabbit, Elena made a series of phone calls that would prove crucial in the days to come. The first was to her mother, who listened in silence as Elena explained the situation in carefully chosen words. "Mia," her mother said when Elena finished, "you did what you had to do. Your grandmother would be proud, but now you have to be smart. This isn't about right and wrong anymore, it's about power." Elena's second call was to Maria Santos, who had already heard rumors about the investigation. "Elena, you need a lawyer," Santos said without preamble, "a good one. The kind who understands military politics and isn't afraid to fight dirty." The name Santos gave her was Captain Jennifer Walsh, a former Marine JAG officer who had transitioned to civilian practice. After winning several high-profile military justice cases, Walsh had made her reputation defending service members who found themselves caught between doing the right thing and following orders. Elena's meeting with Colonel Henderson at 0800 was a masterclass in military diplomacy. Henderson, a career officer with combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, had navigated the complex politics of military leadership for 20 years. He understood that Elena's case had the potential to explode into a public relations nightmare. "For the Corps, Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Henderson began, his office Spartan except for photos of Marines he'd served with and commanded, "I want you to know that I've reviewed your service record. Your performance has been exemplary. Your conduct has been above reproach, which makes yesterday's incident all the more concerning." Elena remained at attention, her eyes fixed on a point above Henderson's head. "Sir, I respectfully request the opportunity to give my account of yesterday's events." Henderson nodded. "I'm listening." Elena's account was precise and unemotional. She described Morrison's behavior, his inappropriate handling of her weapon, and her response. She emphasized that she had used minimal force to disengage Morrison's grip and had demonstrated her marksmanship capabilities as requested. General Morrison said that women like Staff Sergeant Vasquez needed to be put in their place, Chun testified. He said that allowing women in combat roles was weakening the Corps, and that he intended to make an example of her. The testimony sent shockwaves through the base command structure. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident was now revealed as part of a broader pattern of discrimination and harassment. The Marine Corps found itself facing not just a court-martial, but a potential scandal that could damage its reputation and recruitment efforts. Media attention began to focus on Elena's case when Captain Walsh strategically leaked details of Morrison's behavior to reporters who covered military affairs. The story that emerged resonated far beyond military circles. A highly skilled female sniper facing retaliation from a superior officer who couldn't accept women in combat roles. Elena found herself at the center of a national conversation about women in the military, sexual harassment, and the changing nature of combat in the 21st century. Reporters requested interviews, which Elena declined on advice of counsel. But her silence only seemed to intensify public interest in her story. The conflict escalated when Congresswoman Sarah Martinez, the first Latina to serve on the House Armed Services Committee, announced that she would be holding hearings on discrimination against women in the military. Martinez had been following Elena's case through media reports and had decided to use it as a vehicle for broader reforms. Staff Sergeant Vasquez represents the best of what our military can be, Martinez said in a prepared statement. She's a decorated combat veteran who has served her country with distinction. If the Marine Corps is more interested in protecting the feelings of dinosaurs like General Morrison than in supporting its finest warriors, then Congress needs to step in. The political dimensions of Elena's case created new pressures for everyone involved. Marine Corps' leadership found themselves caught between defending their traditional hierarchies and adapting to changing social expectations. General Morrison, meanwhile, began to realize that his attempt to discipline Elena had backfired spectacularly. Elena's days during this period were surreal. Stripped of her normal duties, she found herself in administrative limbo, required to report to base each day but with no meaningful work to perform. She spent her time in a small office, reviewing regulations and preparing for her upcoming Article 32 hearing. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her situation. Many of her colleagues avoided her, unwilling to be associated with a case that had become so controversial. Others offered support, but did so quietly. Afraid of being caught up in the investigation. Rabbit was one of the few who remained openly loyal to Elena. He visited her daily, bringing news from the unit and updates on the investigation. "Ma'am, you need to know that most of the guys are on your side," he told her during one visit. "They've seen you in action. They know you're the real deal. It's just that nobody wants to stick their neck out while this thing is still pending." Elena appreciated Rabbit's loyalty, but she also understood the position her colleagues were in. Military careers were fragile things, and being associated with a controversial case could have lasting consequences. She couldn't blame them for protecting themselves. The Article 32 hearing, the military equivalent of a grand jury proceeding, was scheduled for 6 weeks after the initial incident. As the date approached, both sides prepared for what would essentially be a preview of the potential court-martial. Elena's legal team had assembled a formidable case. They had video evidence showing Morrison grabbing Elena's rifle, witness testimony about his inappropriate comments regarding women in combat, and expert analysis of Elena's shooting performance that demonstrated her exceptional skill and professionalism. Morrison's legal team, meanwhile, attempted to portray Elena as an unstable individual who had overreacted to routine criticism. They emphasized her training in hand-to-hand combat and suggested that her response to Morrison's actions was disproportionate and dangerous. The hearing took place in a sterile military courtroom on base, with Captain Rebecca Foster presiding as the investigating officer. Foster, a career JAG officer with combat experience in Iraq, was tasked with determining whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to court-martial. Elena's first glimpse of Morrison since the incident came when he entered the courtroom in dress blues, his injured arm in a sling that seemed unnecessarily dramatic given the minor nature of his injury. His testimony was carefully crafted to portray himself as a concerned commander dealing with a problematic subordinate. Staff Sergeant Vasquez had been brought to my attention for attitude problems and difficulty accepting feedback, Morrison testified. When I attempted to provide guidance on her weapons handling, she responded with immediate violence. This is not the behavior we expect from Marines, regardless of their gender. Elena's jaw tightened as Morrison continued his testimony, painting her as an unstable individual who posed a threat to good order and discipline. The narrative was carefully constructed to push every button about women in combat roles. The suggestion that they were too emotional, too unpredictable, too dangerous to trust with weapons and authority. Captain Walsh's cross-examination of Morrison was surgical in its precision. She methodically dismantled his version of events, highlighting inconsistencies in his testimony and forcing him to admit that he had initiated physical contact by grabbing Elena's rifle. "General Morrison," Walsh said during one particularly effective exchange, "you testified that you grabbed Staff Sergeant Vasquez's rifle to provide guidance on her weapons handling. Is it standard practice for general officers to physically handle enlisted personnel's weapons without permission?" Morrison's face flushed red. "I was providing instruction that involved physically taking control of a weapon that belonged to another Marine without their consent. She was under my command. Was she under your command, General? Because my understanding is that Staff Sergeant Vasquez reports to Colonel Martinez in the 3rd Battalion, not to you directly." The exchange continued for nearly an hour, with Walsh systematically exposing the weaknesses in Morrison's position. By the time she finished, Morrison appeared rattled and defensive, his carefully constructed narrative in shambles. Elena's testimony, by contrast, was calm and professional. She recounted the events of that morning with clinical precision, emphasizing Morrison's inappropriate behavior and her measured response to it. "I used the minimum force necessary to protect my equipment and maintain my professional dignity," Elena testified. "General Morrison had no authority to handle my weapon, and his comments about my gender and competence were inappropriate and unprofessional." The shooting demonstration that followed Elena's testimony was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the hearing. At Walsh's request, Elena was allowed to demonstrate her marksmanship skills under controlled conditions. The same targets that had been set up for her confrontation with Morrison were arranged on the range, and Elena was given the opportunity to replicate her performance. With Captain Foster and a panel of military observers watching, Elena fired 10 shots in conditions similar to those on the day of the incident. 9 of the 10 shots were perfect hits. The 10th missed the center ring by less than an inch due to a sudden gust of wind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh said as they returned to the courtroom, "you have just witnessed the performance of one of the most skilled snipers in Marine Corps history. Does this look like the behavior of an unstable individual who poses a threat to military discipline?" The hearing concluded with character witnesses testifying on Elena's behalf. Her former commanding officers praised her professionalism and combat effectiveness. Fellow snipers spoke about her skills and dedication. Even some who had initially been skeptical of women in combat roles acknowledged that Elena had earned their respect through her actions in the field. The most powerful testimony came from Master Sergeant David Kim, who had served as Elena's team leader during her 2nd deployment to Afghanistan. Kim, a Korean War veteran with 30 years of service, spoke with the authority of someone who had seen combat in multiple conflicts. "I've served with thousands of Marines over 3 decades," Kim testified. "I've seen the best and the worst of what this Corps has to offer. Staff Sergeant Vasquez is simply one of the finest Marines I've ever known. Her gender is irrelevant. Her skills are exceptional. Her character is unquestionable. If we're going to prosecute her for defending her professional dignity, then we've lost sight of what it means to be a Marine." As the hearing concluded, Elena felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. The evidence seemed to support her position, but she had learned not to underestimate the power of institutional bias and the military's resistance to change. Captain Foster's recommendation would not be released for several days, leaving Elena in continued limbo. But the hearing had accomplished something important. It had created a public record of Morrison's behavior and Elena's response, establishing the foundation for whatever legal battles lay ahead. The aftermath of the hearing saw increased media attention and political pressure. Congresswoman Martinez announced that her hearings would proceed regardless of the outcome of Elena's case, and other female service members began coming forward with their own stories of discrimination and harassment. Elena realized that her case had become larger than her individual circumstances. She was now a symbol in a broader struggle about the role of women in combat and the military's willingness to adapt to changing social realities. The weight of that symbolism was both empowering and terrifying. Late at night in her apartment, Elena would sit with her grandmother's rosary and pray for wisdom, strength, and the courage to see her fight through to the end. She had crossed the Rubicon that morning on the firing range, and there was no going back. All she could do now was move forward with dignity and determination, trusting that truth would ultimately prevail over prejudice and politics. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Elena's individual courage, but the Marine Corps' commitment to the principles of honor, courage, and commitment that it claimed to embody. The breakthrough in Elena's case came from an unexpected source, a 20-year-old private first class named Tommy Wu, who had been operating the range's digital recording system on the day of the confrontation with General Morrison. Wu had been too intimidated to come forward initially, but as the investigation intensified and media attention grew, his conscience finally overcame his fear. Wu's revelation came during a late-night phone call to Captain Walsh's office, 3 weeks after the Article 32 hearing. His voice shaking with nervousness, Wu explained that he had high-definition audio and video footage of the entire incident, footage that had not been included in the initial evidence package because he had been ordered to delete it by a senior NCO acting on Morrison's instructions. "Ma'am," Wu whispered into the phone, "I couldn't bring myself to delete it. Staff Sergeant Vasquez saved my squad leader's life in Fallujah. I've seen her in action, and I know she's not the person they're trying to make her out to be. The footage shows everything, what the general said, how he grabbed her rifle, everything." Walsh immediately drove to Camp Pendleton to meet with Wu, accompanied by a civilian forensics expert who could authenticate the digital evidence. What they discovered was even more damaging to Morrison's case than they had hoped. The high-definition audio had captured not just the public confrontation, but Morrison's comments immediately before grabbing Elena's rifle. In crystal-clear audio, Morrison could be heard saying to another officer, "Time to put this bitch in her place. These women think they can play soldier, but they fall apart when a real man challenges them." The video showed Morrison's body language and facial expression as he grabbed Elena's rifle, not the concerned superior officer providing guidance that he had described in his testimony, but a man acting with deliberate aggression and disrespect. The footage also captured Elena's restrained and professional response, contradicting Morrison's portrayal of her as unstable and violent. Captain Walsh knew that this evidence would not only exonerate Elena but would likely end Morrison's career. However, she also understood that powerful people would try to suppress or discredit the footage. She immediately made multiple copies and secured them with different parties, including sending one to Congresswoman Martinez's office. The revelation of the suppressed evidence triggered a new phase of the investigation. The Marine Corps' Criminal Investigation Division, CID, launched a probe into who had ordered the deletion of the footage and why it had been concealed from Elena's defense team. The investigation quickly expanded to include Morrison's entire command structure. Colonel Henderson found himself in an impossible position. As Elena's immediate commanding officer, he had been trying to balance loyalty to the chain of command with growing evidence that Morrison had acted improperly. Discovery of the suppressed evidence forced him to choose sides in a conflict that was tearing apart his command. Henderson's decision came during a private meeting with Elena in his office, 2 days after Wu's evidence surfaced. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions, "I owe you an apology. I trusted the system to work fairly, but the system was being manipulated by people who should have known better." Elena remained at attention, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented admission from her commanding officer. Henderson continued, "I've reviewed the evidence that Private Wu preserved. What General Morrison did was wrong, and what happened afterward was worse. You deserve better from your leadership, and I intend to make sure you get it." The colonel's support proved crucial as the investigation expanded. Henderson used his authority to protect Elena from retaliation while ensuring that other potential witnesses felt safe to come forward. His action sent a signal throughout the base that the leadership was committed to finding the truth, regardless of the political consequences. The impact of Henderson's support became clear when Staff Sergeant Maria Santos requested a meeting with Elena's legal team. Santos had been struggling with her conscience since the incident, knowing that she possessed information that could help Elena's case, but afraid of the career consequences of speaking out. "I've been documenting General Morrison's behavior for months," Santos told Walsh and Torres during a confidential interview. "He's made inappropriate comments about every female service member in his command. He's created a hostile work environment and retaliated against anyone who challenged him." Santos produced a detailed log of Morrison's comments and actions, including dates, times, and witnesses. The documentation painted a picture of systematic discrimination and harassment that went far beyond Elena's individual case. The most damning entry in Santos's log was dated just 2 weeks before the firing range incident. Morrison had attended a briefing about integrating women into previously all-male combat roles and had been overheard saying, "Over my dead body will some lesbian feminists turn my Marines into social justice warriors. I'll drive them out before I let them contaminate my command." As more evidence emerged, the political dimensions of Elena's case intensified. Congresswoman Martinez's promised hearings were now scheduled for the following month, and Martinez had made it clear that she intended to use Elena's case as a catalyst for broader reforms in military culture. The Marine Corps' leadership faced a crisis of credibility. If they proceeded with charges against Elena in the face of mounting evidence of Morrison's misconduct, they would appear to be prioritizing the protection of senior officers over justice for enlisted personnel. If they dropped the charges, they would be admitting that the initial investigation had been flawed or biased. General Patricia Williams, the Marine Corps' highest-ranking female officer, was brought in to review Elena's case and recommend a path forward. Williams had broken barriers throughout her career and understood the unique challenges facing women in combat roles. Her involvement signaled that the Marine Corps was taking the matter seriously at the highest levels. Williams's review was thorough and uncompromising. She interviewed Elena personally, spending 3 hours going over every aspect of her service record and the events leading up to the confrontation with Morrison. At the end of the interview, Williams made a statement that would become legendary in Marine Corps circles. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Williams said, "you are exactly the kind of Marine this Corps needs more of: skilled, professional, and willing to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you personally. The Corps owes you an apology, and I intend to make sure you get it." The formal apology came in the form of a base-wide formation called by Colonel Henderson. Standing before 2,000 Marines in their dress blue uniforms, Henderson read a statement that had been carefully crafted to acknowledge the injustice Elena had faced while preserving the dignity of the institution. "The Marine Corps prides itself on the principles of honor, courage, and commitment," Henderson began. "In the case of Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, we failed to live up to those principles." Staff Sergeant Vasquez was subjected to inappropriate conduct by a senior officer, and then faced retaliation for defending her professional dignity. "This is not who we are, and this is not who we aspire to be." The statement continued with a formal apology to Elena and a commitment to reforms that would prevent similar incidents in the future. As Henderson concluded his remarks, something unprecedented happened. The assembled Marines began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that lasted for several minutes. Elena stood at attention throughout the ceremony, her face a mask of professional composure. But those who knew her could see the emotion in her eyes: relief, vindication, and a deep satisfaction that the truth had finally been acknowledged. The ceremony was followed by a series of one-on-one meetings between Elena and senior officers, who had initially been skeptical of her account. One by one, they offered personal apologies and assurances that they would support her continued service. Master Sergeant Thompson, who had initially questioned Elena's version of events, was among those who sought her out. "Vasquez," he said, his gruff voice softened by genuine remorse, "I should have listened better. I should have known that someone with your record wouldn't make up stories. I'm sorry I doubted you." The acknowledgement from Thompson and others, like him, was perhaps more meaningful to Elena than the formal ceremonies. These were the Marines she served alongside daily, the men and women whose respect mattered more than any official recognition. But the most powerful moment of recognition came from an unexpected source: General Morrison himself. Facing the end of his career and possible criminal charges, Morrison requested a private meeting with Elena through her legal team. The meeting took place in a conference room at the base legal offices, with both Elena's lawyers and Morrison's counsel present. Morrison, looking older and more frail than Elena remembered, struggled to find the words to begin. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. My actions that day were inexcusable, and my behavior afterward was even worse. You are a better Marine than I ever was, and I let my prejudices blind me to that truth." Morrison's apology was halting and clearly painful for him to deliver. He spoke about his fear of change, his inability to adapt to the evolving military, and his recognition that his attitudes belonged to a different era. It was a stunning admission from a man who had built his career on projecting strength and authority. Elena listened without interruption, her face impassive. When Morrison finished, she stood slowly and looked directly into his eyes. "General," she said quietly, "I accept your apology. But you need to understand that this was never about you and me personally. This was about the principle that all Marines deserve to be judged by their performance, not their gender. I hope that other senior leaders will learn from your mistakes." The meeting concluded without handshakes or pleasantries, but with a sense that a chapter had been closed. Morrison would retire quietly within the month, his career ending not with the honors typically accorded to general officers, but with the understanding that his legacy would be defined by this confrontation. The broader recognition of Elena's case came through the media coverage that had been building since the initial incident. The story of a decorated female sniper standing up to discrimination had captured the public imagination, and Elena found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of women's progress in the military. The coverage wasn't uniformly positive. Conservative commentators criticized Elena for breaking the chain of command and suggested that women in combat roles were inherently disruptive to military discipline. But the majority of coverage portrayed her as a hero, a skilled professional who had been mistreated by an obsolete system. Elena's family watched the coverage with a mixture of pride and concern. Her mother called after seeing Elena featured on the evening news, her voice filled with emotion. "Mia, the whole neighborhood is talking about you. Mrs. Rodriguez says you're a role model for her daughters. But I worry about what this attention means for your safety and your future." Elena understood her mother's concerns. Fame was a double-edged sword in the military, where standing out could be as dangerous as falling behind. But she also recognized that her case had opened doors for other women who might face similar challenges in the future. The congressional hearings chaired by Congresswoman Martinez provided the most significant platform for Elena to tell her story. Testifying before the House Armed Services Committee, Elena spoke with the same precision and professionalism she brought to her military duties. "Members of Congress," Elena said in her opening statement, "I didn't choose to become a symbol or a cause. I chose to become a Marine. But if my experience can help other women..." "Harmony Phoenix, how do you propose we conduct this transfer?" "Our aircraft is a commercial airliner with 73 souls on board, operating in severe weather conditions. Phoenix, we can establish a safe transfer using our atmospheric transport systems. Your commercial aircraft will be guided to a secure landing at Colorado Springs Municipal Airport, where our diplomatic shuttle will meet you. The shuttle is designed to operate safely in your atmospheric conditions and can accommodate the selected human representatives. Captain Morrison leaned toward the radio. Harmony, this is Captain Morrison, pilot in command of American Airlines. Flight 847. What are your requirements for airport operations? We need to coordinate with ground control and emergency services. Captain Morrison, we are transmitting detailed technical specifications to your air traffic control systems. Our shuttle requires a standard runway for initial approach, but can transition to vertical flight for precise positioning. We recommend clearing civilian aircraft and personnel from the immediate area as a safety precaution. Sarah could hear the controlled chaos of multiple radio frequencies as NORAD operations coordinated with civilian aviation authorities, military commands, and international monitoring stations. Word of first contact was spreading through government channels faster than any security protocol could contain it. Within hours, the entire world would know that humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Phoenix, General Harrison. We're establishing a joint task force for first contact protocols. You'll be accompanied by Dr. James Chun from NASA's Astrobiology Institute, Colonel Maria Santos from Air Force Space Command, and Ambassador Catherine Williams from the State Department. They're being flown to Colorado Springs by military transport. Sarah noted the irony that Dr. James Chun shared her surname, probably no relation, but appropriate that the Chun family name would be represented at humanity's first diplomatic contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. She thought about her parents, who had immigrated to America with dreams of their daughter achieving success in aerospace engineering. They could never have imagined that success would include representing Earth in galactic diplomacy. Roger, General Harrison. I'll coordinate with the team upon arrival at Colorado Springs. Harmony, can you provide an estimated timeline for the diplomatic shuttle arrival? Phoenix, our shuttle will arrive at Colorado Springs Municipal Airport approximately 30 minutes after your aircraft lands. We recommend using this time to prepare your representative team and coordinate with local authorities. Our diplomatic protocols are designed to minimize disruption to your normal aircraft operations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel through the radio. Sarah could hear Major Park reporting visual contact with the research vessel Harmony. Phoenix, NORAD operations. I have eyes on the primary unknown, Harmony research vessel. It's beautiful. Approximately 200 meters in length. Elegant curved surfaces that seem to shift color as it moves through the storm clouds. No visible propulsion systems, but it's maintaining perfect position relative to our formation. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she realized she was about to see technology that represented perhaps centuries of advancement beyond human capability. The research vessel Harmony was not just a spacecraft. It was proof that intelligence in the universe had achieved mastery over physics and engineering that humanity was only beginning to understand. American Airlines 847, Colorado Springs Tower, you're cleared for approach runway 28. Emergency vehicles are standing by, and the airport has been cleared of civilian traffic. Welcome to history, Phoenix. Captain Morrison began the approach checklist with hands that trembled slightly from excitement rather than fear. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and moved back through the cabin, aware that every passenger was staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. Marcus, the young aerospace engineer, looked up from his laptop where he'd been taking notes during the entire radio exchange. Dr. Chun, Phoenix, I can't believe this is happening. First contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. and you're going to be humanity's first ambassador." Walter Thompson adjusted his VFW cap and stood as Sarah passed his row. With military precision, he came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Ma'am, it's been an honor to fly with Phoenix. You represent the best of human aviation, and now you'll represent the best of humanity itself." Sarah returned the salute, feeling the weight of military tradition and civilian hope combining in a moment that transcended all previous boundaries. She was no longer just a retired Air Force colonel or an aerospace consultant. She was carrying the dreams and fears of every human being who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. The aircraft touched down at Colorado Springs Municipal Airport with barely a bump, Captain Morrison's skill evident in the smooth landing despite challenging weather conditions. Through the windows, Sarah could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, their red and blue lights creating a corridor of human technology, welcoming visitors from the stars. But it was what she saw in the distance that took her breath away. Rising from the far end of the airport, illuminated by its own gentle luminescence, was a craft that seemed to embody every dream of flight that humanity had ever conceived. Harmony's diplomatic shuttle was approximately 50 feet in length, its surfaces flowing in curves that suggested both advanced aerodynamics and artistic beauty. It hovered 20 feet above the ground with no visible means of support, waiting with the patience of intelligence that had mastered time as well as space. As Flight 847 rolled to a stop at the terminal gate, Sarah saw Major Park's F-22 formation, executing a ceremonial flyover, 4 of Earth's most advanced fighters saluting. Humanity's first step toward joining a galactic community. The sight was both magnificent and humbling, a reminder of how far human aviation had come and how much farther it could go with new knowledge and cooperation. "Phoenix," Harmony's voice came through the aircraft's radio one final time before she disembarked. "We are honored by your acceptance of our invitation. This moment represents the beginning of a new era for your species, one of cooperation, scientific advancement, and peaceful exploration of the universe." Sarah keyed the microphone for what she knew would be the last transmission from Seat 14A. "Harmony, Phoenix. On behalf of humanity, we look forward to learning from your wisdom and sharing our own perspectives on the joy and challenge of flight. Thank you for choosing peace over power, communication over confrontation." As she stood to leave the aircraft, Sarah felt the eyes of every passenger upon her, 73 souls who would forever remember the night they shared a commercial flight with Earth's first ambassador to the stars. Marcus was frantically typing notes on his laptop. Walter Thompson had tears in his eyes, and Janet Rodriguez stood at attention with military bearing that honored both her brother's memory and humanity's bright future. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison said as Sarah reached the cockpit door, "it's been the honor of my career to have Phoenix aboard for first contact. Fly safe out there among the stars." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar pre-flight excitement that had never diminished through 4 decades of aviation. "Captain, I have a feeling the flying is just beginning." As she walked down the jetway toward a future none of them could have imagined when Flight 847 took off from Denver, Sarah Chun, callsign Phoenix, carried with her the hopes of every human being who had ever dreamed of flight, of exploration, of rising from the challenges of Earth to touch the infinite possibilities of the universe. The storm had passed, the stars were shining, and humanity was about to learn that the sky had never been the limit. It had always been just the beginning. 3 years later, the lecture hall at the Colorado Springs Institute for Aerospace Diplomacy was packed with students from around the world, their faces reflecting the diverse tapestry of humanity, united by a common fascination with flight and the infinite possibilities of space exploration. Dr. Sarah Chun, now bearing the official title of Director of Human Celestial Relations, stood at the podium where she had delivered this same lecture hundreds of times. Yet each telling felt as fresh and significant as that first radio. Transmission from Flight 847. The thing you have to understand about first contact, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through history rather than simply studied it, is that it wasn't really about technology or diplomacy or even scientific advancement. It was about recognizing that the universe is filled with intelligence that shares our curiosity, our drive to explore, and our fundamental desire to understand our place among the stars. Being the authority of someone who had lived through history rather than simply studied it, the recognition from Thompson and others reflected a broader shift in how Elena was perceived within the Corps. She was no longer seen as a female Marine who happened to be skilled, but as the exceptional Marine who happened to be female, a subtle but crucial distinction that represented real progress in institutional attitudes. Elena's reputation extended beyond Camp Pendleton to the broader military community. She received invitations to speak at professional conferences, contribute to military journals, and participate in policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Each opportunity was a chance to advocate for the principles that had guided her throughout her career. At the annual Warrior Summit at Quantico, Elena delivered a keynote address to an audience of senior military leaders from all services. Her speech, titled "Excellence Without Exception," became required reading at military academies and war colleges. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Excellence is not gender-specific, Elena told the assembled officers. It is not racial, ethnic, or cultural. Excellence is about competence, character, and commitment. When we allow prejudice to cloud our judgment about human potential, we weaken our institutions and dishonor our profession. The speech was interrupted multiple times by standing ovations, but Elena's most powerful moment came during the question and answer session. A colonel from the Army asked about the challenges of maintaining unit cohesion when integrating women into combat roles. Elena's response was both personal and professional. "Sir, I've served in combat with Marines of every background imaginable. What creates unit cohesion isn't similarity, it's shared purpose and mutual trust. When Marines know that the person next to them is competent, committed, and willing to sacrifice for the mission, demographics become irrelevant." The institutional changes triggered by Elena's case continued to evolve. The Marine Corps updated its leadership training to include modules on inclusive command, implicit bias, and creating climates of respect. Senior officers were now evaluated, partly on their ability to successfully integrate diverse personnel, and promotion boards included specific consideration of leaders, track records on inclusion, and equal opportunity. Perhaps most significantly, the Corps established the Elena Vasquez Award for professional courage, recognizing Marines who demonstrated moral courage in challenging situations. The award criteria specifically included standing up for professional standards even when facing personal or professional risk. The first recipient of the award was Private Tommy Wu, the young Marine who had preserved the video evidence that exonerated Elena. Wu, now promoted to Lance Corporal, accepted the award in a ceremony attended by Elena and senior leadership from across the Corps. Lance Corporal Wu demonstrated that doing the right thing sometimes requires moral courage that transcends rank and position. Elena said in her presentation remarks, "He reminds us that every Marine, regardless of their place in the hierarchy, has a responsibility to uphold the principles that make our institution worthy of respect." Elena's family had watched her transformation from individual Marine to institutional leader with a mixture of pride and amazement. During her most recent visit home to Los Angeles, her mother hosted a gathering of the entire extended family to celebrate Elena's achievements. "Mia," her mother said as she presented Elena with a new scapular blessed by the parish priest, "your grandmother would be so proud. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all the girls who will come after you." Elena's nephew Miguel, now 16 and considering military service, asked her whether she ever regretted her confrontation with General Morrison. Elena's response reflected years of reflection on that pivotal moment. "Miguel, every choice has consequences." That day, on the firing range, I chose to stand up for my professional dignity and the principles I'd sworn to defend. The consequences were difficult, but they led to changes that will help other people avoid the discrimination I faced. I can live with those consequences. The conversation with Miguel reminded Elena of how her story was being interpreted by the next generation. She received letters from young women across the country who saw her as a role model, and she took that responsibility seriously. Elena made a point of visiting high schools and community centers in underserved communities, sharing her story and encouraging young people to pursue their dreams, regardless of the obstacles they might face. During one such visit to her old high school in East Los Angeles, Elena spoke to an assembly of students who reminded her of herself at their age, hungry for opportunity but uncertain about their chances for success. "When I was your age," Elena told them, "I didn't know any Marines, any snipers, or any women in combat roles. I couldn't see a path from where I was to where I wanted to be. But I learned that paths aren't always visible from the starting point. Sometimes you have to take the first step before you can see the second one." The visit to her high school was emotionally powerful for Elena. She saw in the students' faces the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she had felt 2 decades earlier. The difference was that now there were visible examples of people like them succeeding in fields that had once seemed impossible to enter. Elena's relationship with Rabbit had evolved as well. Now Staff Sergeant Sullivan, he had become Elena's right-hand man in the female integration program, bringing his experience as a spotter and his natural ability to connect with Marines of all backgrounds. "Ma'am," Rabbit said during one of their regular planning meetings, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you just let Morrison have his way that day?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes. Maybe my career would have been easier. Maybe I would have avoided all the stress and controversy. But I also think about all the women who are serving successfully today because we changed the system. That's worth whatever personal cost I paid." The broader military had taken notice of the Marine Corps' successful integration efforts, largely attributed to Elena's leadership and vision. The Army and Navy began implementing similar programs, and Elena found herself consulting on integration strategies across the entire Defense Department. The work was demanding but fulfilling. Elena was helping to shape military culture for a generation of service members who would grow up in a more inclusive and equitable environment. The changes wouldn't eliminate all discrimination or guarantee success for every individual, but they created systems and expectations that made fair treatment more likely. Elena's personal life had also stabilized. She had begun dating Dr. Michael Torres, a civilian physician who worked with veterans' health issues. Torres understood the demands of Elena's career and admired her commitment to reform. Their relationship provided Elena with emotional support and perspective outside the military sphere. "You know," Torres told her during dinner one evening, "I've worked with a lot of veterans who were defined by their trauma. You're defined by how you transformed your trauma into positive change. That's pretty remarkable." Elena appreciated Torres's perspective, but she was careful not to let external validation become too important to her sense of self-worth. The real validation came from seeing young Marines succeed, from witnessing cultural changes in her beloved corps, and from knowing that the institution she loved was becoming more just and inclusive. As Elena's second year in her new role drew to a close, she received an unexpected visitor, General Patricia Williams, the Marine Corps' highest-ranking female officer, who had played a crucial role in Elena's vindication. Williams had been selected for promotion to Commandant of the Marine Corps, the first woman to hold the position in the service's history. Gunnery Sergeant Vasquez, Williams said as they sat in Elena's office, surrounded by photos of successful female Marines and awards recognizing the integration program's achievements. I want you to know that your courage in standing up to Morrison didn't just change your life, it changed the trajectory of our entire institution. Williams continued, when I become commandant next month, I'm going to need leaders who understand both the warrior culture of the Corps and the necessity of evolution. I want you to consider accepting a commission and joining my staff as a special advisor on integration and cultural transformation. The offer was stunning. Elena had never considered becoming an officer, content with her role as a senior enlisted leader. But Williams's invitation represented an opportunity to influence policy at the highest levels of the Marine Corps. Ma'am, Elena replied, I'm honored by your confidence in me. But I need to ask, would this commission be offered because of my qualifications or because of my symbolism as the woman who stood up to Morrison? Williams smiled. Both, and that's exactly why you're the right person for the job. You have the credibility that comes from proven combat leadership and the moral authority that comes from standing up for principle when it cost you personally. That combination is rare and valuable. Elena asked for time to consider the offer, but she already knew her answer. The opportunity to shape policy at the institutional level was too important to pass up, and she trusted Williams's vision for the future of the Corps. The commissioning ceremony took place 6 months later, with Elena's family, colleagues, and Marines from across her career in attendance. As she raised her right hand to take the officer's oath, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman in East Los Angeles who had never imagined military service, to a combat-proven sniper, to an institutional leader helping to reshape one of America's most traditional organizations. Her mother pinned Elena's new lieutenant bars on her uniform, her hands shaking with emotion. Mia, she whispered, your father would be so proud. You became everything we hoped you could be, and so much more. The ceremony was followed by a reception where Elena was congratulated by Marines from throughout her career. Master Sergeant Thompson, now approaching retirement, pulled her aside for a private conversation. Lieutenant Vasquez, he said, using her new title with obvious pride, when you first showed up at our unit, I thought you were just another social experiment that would wash out eventually. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was never more wrong than I was about you. You've made this Corps better, and you've made me a better Marine. As Elena's first year as an officer progressed, she threw herself into the work of institutional transformation with the same intensity she had once applied to perfecting her marksmanship. Working directly with General Williams, Elena helped develop new policies, training programs, and cultural initiatives designed to make the Marine Corps a more inclusive and effective fighting force. The changes were measurable and significant. Retention rates for minority and female Marines reached historic highs. Performance evaluations showed that diverse units consistently outperformed homogeneous ones. Most importantly, the culture of the Corps was evolving slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but definitively toward a more merit-based and inclusive environment. Elena's influence extended beyond policy development to personal mentorship of the next generation of leaders. She maintained relationships with the Marines she had trained and advised, watching with pride as they advanced in their careers and took on leadership roles themselves. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, the recruit who had joined because of Elena's example, was now leading her own sniper team in Afghanistan. In her letters to Elena, Kim described the professional environment she found there, challenging but fair, focused on competence rather than gender. Ma'am, Kim wrote in one letter, yesterday I made a shot that saved my squad from an ambush. Afterward, my squad leader said, nice shooting, Marine. Not nice shooting for a woman or any qualifier. Just recognition of professional competence. That wouldn't have been possible without the changes you fought for. Elena kept Kim's letter in her desk drawer, along with dozens of others from Marines whose careers had been shaped by the cultural transformation she had helped trigger. Each letter was a reminder of why the personal cost of her confrontation with Morrison had been worth paying. The broader impact of Elena's case continued to ripple through American society. Her story had become a case study in business schools, leadership programs, and diversity training across the corporate world. The principle that Elena had embodied, standing up for professional standards, regardless of personal risk, had applications far beyond military service. Elena received invitations to speak at corporate conferences, women's leadership summits, and professional development programs. Each speaking engagement was an opportunity to share the lessons she had learned about courage, integrity, and the importance of challenging systems that perpetuated inequality. During one such event, a Fortune 500 company's annual leadership retreat, Elena was asked by a young executive how to handle workplace discrimination without jeopardizing career advancement. "The question assumes that staying silent is safer than speaking up," Elena replied. "But silence in the face of injustice has its own risks. It corrodes your integrity, it enables bad behavior to continue, and it often leads to bigger problems down the road. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing." Elena's personal life had also evolved during her transition to officer status. Her relationship with Dr. Torres had deepened into an engagement, with wedding plans set for the following year. Torres had been offered a position with the Veterans Administration that would allow him to continue his work with military families while supporting Elena's career. "I've never been with someone whose work was so directly connected to making the world better," Torres told Elena as they planned their future together. "Marrying you means marrying your mission, and I can't think of anything I'd rather be part of." The wedding, when it came, was a blend of military tradition and personal meaning. Elena wore her dress blue uniform, while Torres chose a civilian tuxedo. The ceremony was officiated by Father Rodriguez, the chaplain who had helped Elena work through the moral complexities of her sniper role years earlier. In his homily, Father Rodriguez spoke about the parable of the talents, connecting it to Elena's journey. Elena received gifts of marksmanship, leadership, and moral courage. But gifts unused are gifts wasted. By using her talents in service of justice and equality, Elena has multiplied those gifts into blessings for countless others. The reception was attended by Marines from every phase of Elena's career, from her first commanding officers to the young Marines she was currently mentoring. The diversity of the gathering officers and enlisted men and women, Marines of every background and specialty, was itself a testament to the changes Elena had helped bring about. During the reception, General Williams presented Elena with a surprise gift: the actual Barrett M82, a one rifle that had been at the center of her confrontation with Morrison. The weapon had been refurbished and engraved with Elena's name, service dates, and an inscription that read, "Courage is contagious." "This rifle," Williams said in her presentation remarks, "is more than just a weapon. It's a symbol of the principle that excellence knows no gender, and that standing up for what's right sometimes requires risking everything you've worked for." Elena accepted the rifle with deep emotion, remembering the weight of it in her hands on that desert morning when everything changed. The weapon would be displayed in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the moment when she chose courage over comfort. As Elena and Torres began their married life, Elena continued her work with the same dedication that had defined her entire career. She was now Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, with responsibilities that extended across the entire Marine Corps and influence that reached into the highest levels of military leadership. The institutional changes that had begun with her confrontation with Morrison were now permanent features of Marine Corps culture. The Vasquez Protocol, a system for investigating discrimination complaints that ensured transparency and protected whistleblowers, was being adopted by other military services and federal agencies. More importantly, the cultural shift was generational. Young Marines entering the Corps now found an environment that valued diversity, rewarded merit, and expected leaders to create inclusive climates. The battles that Elena and others had fought were becoming history, replaced by new challenges but also new opportunities. Elena often reflected on the paradox of her success. By refusing to accept unequal treatment, she had helped create a system where future women might never face the discrimination she had endured. It was the best possible outcome, her story becoming irrelevant because the conditions that made it necessary no longer existed. On quiet evenings in her quarters, Elena would sometimes clean her service pistol with the same ritualistic precision she had learned as a young Marine. The routine remained comforting, a connection to the fundamentals of her profession and a reminder of the discipline that had carried her through every challenge. As she worked, Elena would think about the Marines she had mentored, the policies she had helped craft, and the culture she had helped transform. The work was far from complete. True equality would require continued vigilance and effort from multiple generations of leaders. But the foundation had been laid, and Elena took satisfaction in knowing that she had played a crucial role in building it. The legacy Elena was most proud of wasn't her personal advancement or public recognition, but the simple fact that young women entering the Marine Corps today would have opportunities that had been unimaginable when she first enlisted. They would still face challenges, but they would face them in an institution that had been fundamentally changed by the courage of those who had come before. 5 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Memorial Plaza at Marine Corps Base Quantico as Colonel Elena Vasquez-Torres stood before a crowd of 200 Marines, their families, and distinguished guests. The bronze statue being unveiled behind her depicted a female Marine in combat gear, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilant intensity that defined her profession. "This memorial," Elena said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "honors not just the women who have served in combat roles, but the principle that courage and competence know no gender boundaries. It stands as a reminder that our strength as an institution comes not from uniformity, but from the diverse talents and perspectives of those who choose to serve." Conclusion of the Elena Vasquez-Torres story. "No," Walsh agreed, "but they create a narrative. And narratives matter in military justice, even when they shouldn't." She turned to Elena. "Tell me about Gunnery Sergeant Tommy Wu." Elena's face brightened slightly. "Wu, he's solid. One of the best NCOs I've worked with." "Why?" "Because he recorded the entire incident on his phone," Walsh said, producing a small digital device. "Apparently, he had a feeling something was going to happen when Morrison showed up at the range. He kept recording even after Morrison ordered everyone to disperse." Torres leaned forward. "That changes everything." Walsh nodded grimly. "It should. But Morrison's lawyers are arguing that Wu violated regulations by recording a superior officer without permission. They want the recording excluded from evidence." Over the following weeks, as the Article 32 hearing approached, Elena watched her world divide into two camps. Marines she had served with for years suddenly avoided eye contact in the chow hall. Others made a point of greeting her more warmly than usual, their support obvious and deliberate. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, a young Marine Elena had mentored, approached her one evening outside the barracks. "Staff Sergeant Torres," she said formally, then glanced around and lowered her voice. "Elena, I want you to know that what happened on that range, half the enlisted Marines are talking about it. Morrison's been pulling the same crap on other women Marines. You're the first one who stood up to him." "Martinez, you need to be careful." "No," Martinez interrupted. "We need to be brave. Like you were." She pressed a folded paper into Elena's hand. These are the names of 12 Marines willing to testify about Morrison's pattern of behavior. We're not going to let them railroad you." The Article 32 hearing convened on a gray morning in November. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with Marines from across the base finding reasons to be present. General Patricia Williams, the base commander, sat in the front row, a signal that senior leadership was paying attention. Morrison took the stand first, his bearing confident and his testimony polished. He painted Elena as an insubordinate troublemaker who had physically assaulted him without provocation. His version of events was smooth, practiced, and completely at odds with what Elena remembered. Staff Sergeant Vasquez grabbed my arm aggressively. Morrison testified, and when I attempted to examine her weapon to ensure it was safe, she became increasingly hostile and confrontational. Her behavior was erratic and concerning. Captain Walsh's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. "General Morrison, you testified that you approached Staff Sergeant Vasquez because you were concerned about safety on the firing line. That's correct. Yet according to the range safety officer's log, there had been no safety violations that day. No misfires, no equipment malfunctions, no protocol breaches. Is that your understanding?" Morrison shifted slightly in his chair. "I was conducting a general inspection. A general inspection that focused solely on one Marine? The only female Marine on the firing line that day? I don't see how gender is relevant." "General Morrison," Walsh interrupted, "in your 30-year career, how many times have you personally examined an enlisted Marine's weapon during a routine training exercise?" The silence stretched for long seconds. Morrison's jaw worked as he considered his answer. "I don't keep count of such things." When Wu took the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. The young gunnery sergeant was nervous but determined, his testimony clear and unwavering. "I started recording because General Morrison was acting strange," Wu testified. "He had this look on his face, like he was hunting something. When he grabbed Staff Sergeant Torres's weapon without permission, I knew something was wrong." The video, played on a large screen at the front of the room, was devastating to Morrison's case. It showed Elena's calm professionalism, Morrison's aggressive behavior, and the shocked reactions of the other Marines present. Most damaging of all, it captured Morrison's parting words, "You people need to learn your place." Elena's own testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the hearing. She spoke quietly but firmly, describing not just the incident itself, but the broader pattern of discrimination she had faced throughout her career. "I didn't join the Marine Corps to prove a point about women combat," she said. "I joined because I wanted to serve my country alongside the finest warriors in the world. Every day, I've tried to earn my place through performance, not politics. But there are people in this Corps who will never see me as anything but a diversity experiment, no matter what I accomplish." She looked directly at Morrison as she continued. "General Morrison didn't grab my weapon because he was concerned about safety. He grabbed it because he wanted to remind me, and everyone watching, that he had power over me. That my achievements didn't matter because I would always be subject to his arbitrary authority." The parade of supporting witnesses that followed painted a picture of systematic harassment that extended far beyond Elena's case. Martinez testified about Morrison's inappropriate comments during her own evaluations. 2 other female Marines described similar incidents where Morrison had questioned their competence in ways that their male counterparts never experienced. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Master Sergeant Patricia Thompson, a logistics specialist with 20 years of service. Thompson described the pattern of behavior where Morrison routinely assigned female Marines to administrative roles regardless of their specialties, citing concerns about their ability to handle real military work. "General Morrison told me directly," Thompson testified, "that women in combat roles were a social experiment that was undermining unit cohesion. He said it was his duty to limit the damage by keeping us in appropriate positions." The hearing officer, Colonel James Mitchell, deliberated for 3 days before reaching his conclusion. When the proceedings reconvened, the room was again packed to capacity. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, Mitchell announced, "I find that the charges against Staff Sergeant Vasquez are not supported by credible evidence. The government has failed to demonstrate that Staff Sergeant Vasquez acted improperly or in violation of military regulations." The relief that washed over Elena was quickly replaced by apprehension. She had won the legal battle, but the war for her career was far from over. Morrison supporters within the command structure made their displeasure known through subtle but effective means. Elena found herself assigned to increasingly isolated duties, passed over for training opportunities, and excluded from planning sessions she would normally attend. The breaking point came 6 months later when Elena was denied selection for the Advanced Infantry Leaders course, despite having the highest scores on all prerequisite examinations. The official rejection letter cited command concerns about her ability to work effectively within the chain of command. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters writing what she assumed would be her resignation letter. She had given the Marine Corps everything she had, but it seemed determined to reject her contributions. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find General Williams standing in the hallway, alone and out of uniform. "May I come in, Staff Sergeant?" Williams asked. Elena stepped aside, confused by the unusual visit. Williams sat down across from Elena's small desk and looked directly at her. "I'm here to offer you a choice," Williams said. "You can continue fighting this system from the inside, knowing that it will be difficult and that some people will never accept you. Or you can leave the Corps with honor and find a different way to serve." Elena set down her pen. "With respect, General, what makes you think I have a choice? My career here is over." Williams smiled grimly. "Staff Sergeant, do you know why I'm really here? Because I've been watching you for 2 years, ever since you arrived at Pendleton. I've been watching how you train, how you lead, and how you handle adversity. Morrison did me a favor by forcing this confrontation, because it showed me exactly what kind of Marine you are." She leaned forward. "I'm about to take command of the Marine Corps' Combat Development Command. I need staff NCOs who understand that our strength comes from excellence, not exclusion. I need Marines who are willing to challenge assumptions and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." Elena stared at her. "You're offering me a position?" "I'm offering you a mission," Williams corrected. "Help me build a Marine Corps that judges people by their performance instead of their demographics. It won't be easy, and you'll face resistance from people who think change threatens tradition. But if you're willing to fight, I'm willing to lead." 3 months later, Elena reported to Quantico as a newly promoted gunnery sergeant, assigned to the Combat Development Command's Infantry Integration Task Force. Her first assignment was to develop training protocols for mixed-gender infantry units, using lessons learned from the successful integration of other military specialties. The work was challenging and often frustrating. She spent long hours analyzing data, interviewing Marines, and drafting policy recommendations that she knew would face fierce opposition from traditionalists within the Corps. But for the first time since the confrontation with Morrison, Elena felt like she was fighting for something larger than her own career. The real test came when the first fully integrated infantry companies deployed to combat zones in Afghanistan. Elena's training protocols were put to the ultimate test under conditions where failure could mean lives lost. The results exceeded all expectations. Mixed-gender units demonstrated superior performance in counterinsurgency operations, particularly in missions requiring interaction with civilian populations. Female Marines proved invaluable in gathering intelligence from Afghan women, while male Marines benefited from the different perspectives and approaches their female counterparts brought to problem-solving. 6 months into the deployment, Elena received a message that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Staff Sergeant Martinez, now serving as a squad leader in one of the integrated units. Gunny Torres wanted you to know that your training saved lives yesterday. We walked into an ambush, but because you taught us to think differently about team dynamics and communication, we adapted faster than the enemy expected. 2 Marines are going home to their families because you had the courage to stand up to Morrison and show us a better way. Semper Fi. Elena's vindication was complete when General Morrison was quietly reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, effectively ending his operational career. Wu, meanwhile, was selected for promotion to Staff Sergeant and assigned to the prestigious Marine Corps Scout Sniper School as an instructor. But the real measure of Elena's success came in the statistics that accumulated over the following years. Female Marine retention rates increased by 40%. Performance evaluations showed consistent improvement across all metrics when units operated with inclusive leadership. Most importantly, the number of discrimination complaints dropped to historic lows as the Corps' culture shifted toward true meritocracy. Elena's own career flourished in ways she had never imagined possible. She was selected for commissioning through the Officer Candidate School, graduated first in her class, and was assigned to command positions that had previously been closed to women. Each success opened doors for the Marines who would follow her path. On a warm spring morning 10 years after the confrontation on the firing range, Colonel Elena Vasquez-Torres stood before a formation of newly commissioned Marine officers at Quantico. Among them were dozens of women who would take their places as infantry officers, artillery officers, and special operations leaders, positions that had been unthinkable when Elena first picked up her rifle. "Marines," she told them, "you are inheriting a corps that has learned to value performance over prejudice, character over demographics. You didn't have to fight the battles that previous generations fought, but you will face your own tests of courage and principle. When those moments come, remember that individual actions can create institutional change. Remember that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost." As the ceremony concluded and the new officers dispersed to their first assignments, Elena reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her to this moment. A single act of defiance on a desert firing range had set in motion changes that transformed an entire institution. The Barrett rifle that had been at the center of the controversy was now displayed in the Marine Corps Museum, accompanied by a plaque that read, "Precision in all things marksmanship, judgment, and justice." But Elena's true legacy wasn't in museums or monuments. It lived in the daily choices of Marines who understood that excellence had no gender, that courage came in many forms, and that the highest traditions of the Corps were served not by excluding people, but by demanding the very best from everyone privileged to wear the eagle, globe, and anchor. The desert wind still carried the scent of cordite across Camp Pendleton's ranges. But now it also carried something else. The promise that every Marine, regardless of background, could rise as high as their courage and competence would take them. Elena had kept her promise to herself, made on that pivotal morning years ago. She had proven that she belonged not by lowering standards, but by exceeding them. And in doing so, she had changed what it meant to be a Marine for generations to come.